So you'll see here that in a vertical speed climb, like we're showing here, and we're using, let's say, that 1,000 foot per minute again, and we're climbing at 1,000 feet a minute, and again, I don't have the MCP here, but we've pushed vertical speed button, the light bar illuminated. This says vertical speed, VS. Green attention box for 10 seconds, and you take the thumb wheel and you spin it up to 1,000 feet a minute. Well, the auto throttle is going to increase the power to hold your speed at 250. And it can do that just fine because you're calling for a reasonable vertical rate up. And it can add power, and it's not anywhere close to the reference thrust, whatever that is. Let's say climb 2 or climb 1 or climb whatever it is. But again, if you call for something that's a little unreasonable, like in this case, 3,500 feet a minute, we spin it up to that, and the airplane, the elevator pitches to maintain 3,500 feet a minute, the power will increase up to the reference thrust, which let's say is, climb 1 or climb 2 in our case. It can't go any further than that. So what's going to happen to the speed? It's going to start doing this. It's going to start dropping from that 250 knot commanded speed, and it'll start dropping, and it could go below the up bug, and it could go below, keep decreasing. And when it gets to the red boxes, or the minimum maneuvering speed, and then to the red boxes, you could get a stall. You'll get buffet, and then you get a stall. It can go into a stall. There's no protection, in other words. So you can overspeed the airplane, you can underspeed the airplane when you're in vertical speed and you're using an improper vertical speed. So no speed protection. And that's why we don't like to use it as a normal pitch mode. Here we are in the descent, the vertical speed descent. So again, you go to vertical speed, you push the vertical speed push button on the MCP, light bar illuminates in the switch. You get VS here, green attention box for 10 seconds. You take the thumb wheel and you go to 1,000 feet a minute down. The elevator will pitch for 1,000 feet per minute down. The auto throttle will reduce the power to keep you at 250 knots. And it can do that because it's within the normal range between idle thrust and your reference thrust. So no problem, as long as this is kind of a reasonable figure. But if we start to say, well, I need more than that, so I start to go to 2,000 feet a minute, well, now you're going to start to have a little bit of a problem because the elevator will pitch for 2,000 feet a minute, and again, the power will come back to idle, but the speed will be allowed to increase. It has to increase because the auto throttle's done its job. It can only do its job to idle or the full reference thrust or somewhere in between. But in this case, the speed will start to increase, and now we have no speed. I won't say protection, but we can't control the speed. And the speed will be allowed to increase. And if it continues to increase and we get to barber pole, you could overspeed the airplane. So again, big thing here, no speed protection when you're in vertical speed. And that's why we don't use it. We used to use this, when we were doing non-precision approaches. And we were using, it was a vertical speed non-precision approach. And early on, like, 20 years ago, 25 years ago, we used to dive and drive. We used to use vertical speed to get down to the altitude, the next altitude, and then dive and drive to the next altitude. And then you would, from the final approach fix in, you'd go down, I forget what it was, maybe like 1,500 feet a minute, and then you'd back it off to 1,000 feet a minute, and then you would push altitude hold at the MDA. So we used to use vertical speed for non-precision approaches. And then we went to vertical speed constant angle non-precision approaches. Then we went to VNAV non-precision approaches, which is kind of where we're at now. Or if you're in the Dash 8, the IAN approaches, the integrated approach nav. But there we had more of the use of vertical speed because we did use it for a non-precision approach. But nowadays we don't, because they're VNAV non-precision approaches. So the uses are more limited, but there's some places where you have to come out, and it may be more advantageous to go into vertical speed. I think coming out of Frankfurt, and I haven't come out of there a lot, but I think there's some cases where coming out of London, sometimes they want you to reduce your rate, and you may have to, it may be good to just use vertical speed to do that instead of messing with, VNAV gives you the full reference thrust. And if you go to flight level change, you kind of have to adjust the thrust levers. So if you need a specific rate, then vertical speed can be used. And there's some cases, more in Europe than in the States, where you may use vertical speed in order to comply with what ATC wants you to do. And that's usually going to be less of a vertical rate because they want you to reduce your rate to fit in with all the other threading of aircraft that they have coming in and out of London or in and out of Frankfurt, things like that. So do we use vertical speed? Yeah, in some situations. What's a use for vertical speed? I can think of one. There's probably more than one, but I can think of one right off the top of my head. You're on an ILS approach, and you arm the localizer, and you capture the localizer. And let's say you haven't armed the approach yet. You just capture the localizer. And now, after you capture the localizer, you're going to go ahead and arm the approach and to get the glide slope armed. Well, you forget to arm the approach, and now the glide slope starts coming in. You go gear down flaps 20, and now the glide slope captures. You go flaps 30, but you forgot to arm the approach. So now the glide slope, we're going high on the glide slope, and now we've got no capture on the glide slope. That's a use for vertical speed, because now you can, when you recognize that, you can open the VS window, you could spin your altitude down or get it out of the way. You just want to make sure it doesn't capture again. You could push the vertical speed open. You could bring it to 1,500 feet a minute, and you can start to descend in order to capture the glide slope. And you're probably going to need more than 1,000 feet a minute to do that. And you're at flaps 30 at that point. The speed's not going to increase all that much at 1,500 feet a minute. So you'll increase the descent rate to kind of catch up with the glide slope, and now you've armed the approach, and now the glide slope will capture. And now you're out of vertical speed when that does that. That's a use for vertical speed because you screwed up, you forgot to arm the approach, you go high on the glide slope, and now I say whoops, and I open the vertical speed window and spin in. Now what can happen if you don't get the altitude window out of the way? It can capture the altitude window again, and that's a real mess. And sometimes that happens, and people are, well, tell them we need the vectors to go back for the. So there's cases where you have to kind of know what you're doing on the mode control panel in order that you don't recapture an altitude. And but that's a use for vertical speed, a practical one, because you messed up not arming the approach.